Hey, and a really warm welcome to Big Questions, whether you're here with a friend or just picked up a flyer on your way out of a lecture. It's really great to have you here. My name is V. Do keep coming in and grab a sandwich, have a seat. This is a space to ask, discuss, and investigate some of those big questions about life, its meaning, and the claims of Jesus. So this week, we're going to be looking at the miraculous claims of the Bible and whether they could be true in any way. Soon we'll be hearing a short talk, and after that there'll be some time for questions. So do text in your questions to the number that you can see here on the lectern and on the pillars around you. We'd really love to hear what you think. We'd love to have a discussion, so no question is off limits. We're really excited to have Dr. Denis Alexander here as our speaker today. Denis is the Emeritus Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He's a fellow at St. Edmund's College here in Cambridge, and he has previously worked in the biomedical research community for over 40 years, most recently at the Babraham Institute. So please join me in welcoming Denis to the front.
Well, thanks very much. Welcome. It's good to be here. I've been back to the CICCU events for a few times over the years, but it's great to be tackling this important subject today. I suppose it's true to say that the generally secular environment in which we live, especially those of us who are scientists, we're not really supposed to believe in miracles. We aren't supposed to do that according to the dominant secular narrative in which we live. So it might actually surprise you, at least surprise the Natskis who are here, and I bet there's quite a few, that quite a few of your lectures during the coming year will be, in fact, from scientists in this university who do believe in miracles. And the reason for that, of course, is there are actually plenty of Christians around in the different scientific departments in this university. In fact, probably far more than in the humanities, I suspect. And of course, to be a Christian, you have to believe in the resurrection. But clearly, there are plenty of other scientists who don't believe in miracles. And here is Richard Dawkins from the other place, who asserts that all the miracles spoken of in the Bible, and I quote here from Dawkins, are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they're very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world, close quote. I want to suggest there are several problems with his claim. We'll be looking at problems as we go along. But one of them is that nearly all the natural philosophers, as the scientists were called back in the 17th century, those people who founded the disciplines that we now practice in science, were pretty much all Christians and who certainly believed in miracles. There were people like those listed here: Robert Boyle, René Descartes, John Gray, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, James Clerk Maxwell, who founded the Cavendish Lab here in Cambridge, and hundreds and hundreds of more. I think these sort of people were probably pretty sophisticated. And as I just mentioned, there are plenty of leading scientists in our own time who believe in biblical miracles. I think it would be hard to claim, for example, that the masters of, let's say, Magdalen College and Jesus College and Darwin College, I can name a few more, were not very sophisticated thinkers. Recently, there was a journalist called John Horgan who interviewed Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a committed Christian. He's also director of the National Institutes, 19 of them, National Institutes of Health in the USA, which is about the biggest sort of science job in the world, you could say. Horgan said, as he carried on the interview, as a scientist who looks for natural explanations of things and demands evidence, how can you also believe in miracles like the resurrection? And Collins replies, I don't have a problem with the concept that miracles might occasionally occur at moments of great significance, where there is a message being transmitted to us by God Almighty. But as a scientist, I set my standards for miracles very high. Now, of course, this sort of leads on to what we really understand, I think, by a miracle. Okay, so we have a few examples of the way that people use miracle in their daily speech. It was a real miracle that I got into Cambridge, maybe some person might want to say. The newspapers like their headlines with the word miracle in, miracle rescue of baby from earthquake rubble, that sort of thing. And generally, the word is used to draw attention to the unexpected or the unusual, that sort of thing. I suppose getting into Cambridge is not that unusual, as proven by the number of people here, but it might be possible that it's a miracle for that particular individual, felt it was a miracle that they made it to this university. Generally, scientists think about miracles, I think, the way that Wikipedia does. Quote, a miracle can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being, close quote. Now that understanding, and in a moment I'm going to tell you, it's very different actually from the understanding of the Bible, but that understanding comes from the famous philosopher, Scottish philosopher, David Hume, writing in the 18th century. And it's an understanding that has really influenced lots of people ever since. So here's our roadmap, what I want to say in the next few minutes. I want to just summarize briefly what Hume claimed. I want to then critique his position very briefly, and then I want to go on to say, well, how does the Bible think about miracles? What's different there? Okay. Now, if you want to understand Hume on miracles, there are a couple of background points that you need to know. Apologies to the philosophers here who know all this stuff. But the first is that if you look at the roots of the idea of scientific laws, then this goes back to the 17th century, quite recently in a way, and it has deep theological roots. It goes back to René Descartes, Boyle, and Newton. That's where you find the understanding of scientific laws first appearing in the literature. And the way these natural philosophers reasoned was that just as God has set up moral laws that govern the universe, so there must, ergo, be scientific laws as well, laws of nature that kind of rule over the universe that we live in. And all these early scientists, as we've already mentioned, are people who believed in the miracles, the biblical miracles as well. And they believed also they provided strong evidence for the Christian faith. The second point to notice is that when you come to the following century, when you come to the 18th century, then you find the deists becoming quite powerful. The deists promoted a kind of rationalistic belief in God, but they very much resisted the idea of God who could answer prayer or do miracles or be involved in the daily workings of the world. So, when David Hume came to write his little essay on miracles in 1748, tucked away there in part of his inquiry concerning human understanding, what he's really doing is summarizing the arguments of the deists that would have been pretty familiar actually to people at that time. And the first part of his essay is summarizing what we call the a priori arguments for the impossibility of miracles, referring to those arguments which Hume thought ruled miracles out of court as a kind of matter of principle. So his opening gambit there is to underline the point that experience is our only guide in reasoning concerning matters of fact, quoting from Hume there. However, says Hume, experience is not an infallible guide, its nature is not always predictable, and neither do we know all the possible range of natural causes. Therefore, says Hume, quote, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. The observer should balance the type of evidence which is available to them and establish a kind of certainty-uncertainty scale in which beliefs will vary depending on where they fall on the position on that kind of scale, depending on the available data. Well, so far so good. I think we can probably all agree with that general line of thought. But then Hume goes on to claim that if our experience of something is completely consistent, if in the whole of our lives we have invariably observed the same conjunction of events, if A happens, then B always happens alongside it, then if somebody claims something different, we shouldn't believe it, however strong the evidence. Well, that leads on then to his famous definition of miracles. He concludes, and I quote, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So, Hume tries to establish then that in principle, no witness, no testimony under any possible circumstances would be sufficient to establish the veracity of any miraculous event. Natural laws, he says, are built on uniformity of experience, and miracles are alleged violations of natural laws. Therefore, they don't happen. But we note here, interestingly, that for Hume, a law of nature was something in which our own experience had established a regular concurrence between events to such a high degree there was not even a single occasion which had been observed when this concurrence was lacking. This is actually rather different from the idea of law as introduced by the Christian natural philosophers just a century before, in which the laws of nature are rooted in the will of God, the creator, lawgiver. That's why they exist. So let's just accept Hume's definition of a miracle just for the moment, for the sake of argument. Let's just look at 3 critiques that have been made by philosophers. Of course, I'm being very brief here, and there's a whole big literature on this. But first of all, most people have said, well, Hume's argument looks a bit circular. So if a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, which have in turn been established by unalterable experience, then clearly there can be, by prior definition, no experience anyone could have that would change the situation. And so it's a circular argument. It begs the question, and unfortunately, I think, and I want to suggest, that Hume's argument actually leads to a bit of a closed mind in terms of studying the evidence, which is not what one wants to see amongst scientists in particular, amongst anybody, but scientists in particular, who are supposed to have open minds to the evidence. Second, Hume's idea that a large accumulation of uniform human experience adds up to such a sort of weight, a quantitative weight, that no counter-evidence can possibly overthrow it, I want to suggest is not really a very useful one. Even though no one has until now reliably detected evidence for intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, for example, if you just get a single, unambiguous, intelligent message from somewhere in outer space, that's going to demonstrate very clearly the existence of intelligent life forms elsewhere in the universe. So it's exceptions that science is interested in. I mean, things that happen every day are pretty boring for science. In the future, if you're doing a PhD or something, if you want a paper in Nature, a first author paper in Nature, then you want to find exceptions. That's the way to look. And the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, was famous for making potential falsifiability a key criterion for a valid scientific theory. So as Popper pointed out, however many times you may observe something, you might observe, in this country, for example, all the swans you've seen are white. This is his own example, by the way. All swans are white, therefore all swans are white. You come up with a general principle about swans, but obviously if you observe a single black swan, your whole theory comes crashing to the ground. And falsifiability is still used a lot in science as a criterion for whether a scientific theory is valid as a theory or not. So scientific theory should, in principle, be falsifiable. And I think Hume also failed to realize that the wise and intelligent person bases his or her beliefs on evidence rather than probability. So evidence is weighed, it's not added. Evidence for repeatable phenomena is not necessarily greater than for events which happened only once. And the third critique of Hume is that he was in a particularly weak position to argue that miracles are impossible because they violate the laws of nature, since for Hume, as we've already noted, laws had no necessity. His idea of laws was based on this uniformity of repeated observations. One's always white. I mean, he could have accepted the 17th century Christian view from the natural philosophers then, that understanding of laws put forward by Descartes and all those people, but he chose not to do so, perhaps for interesting reasons. Now, the irony is that nearly all scientists today actually accept, more or less, the 17th century view of natural laws, the Christian view that was promoted in the 17th century, believing that the properties of matter and energy are very deeply rooted in the properties of the universe that we observe. Of course, they often forget the theological roots of that, and historical theological roots of God as lawgiver, but that's the way that most scientists tend to think. So now I want to switch a bit to just thinking, by contrast, what is the biblical understanding of the miraculous? And I think we'll see it's quite different. So we can define a miracle as understood in the Bible as a sign of God's special grace in a particular historical religious context, where the word grace here, it's a theological word, it means God's unmerited love or favor. So the biblical miracles, of course, are set within this theistic matrix in which God is understood to be the creator, the sustainer of all that exists. We're living in the creation. This is one of those things. This is a creation. And so, according to the biblical worldview, God is the upholder and sustainer of all the properties of matter and energy, which in fact lead to science being possible. But on occasion, God chooses to do things differently in order to display his special grace in particular circumstances. And if you go back and look at all the various Greek and Hebrew words used in the Bible, then you find a whole range of them, which we tend to translate as wonders and as acts of power, mighty works, all that sort of thing. Perhaps the most important of these is the little word, Hebrew word, ot, which is in the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, and its equivalent in the New Testament, semeion, signs from which we get semiotics. And perhaps these are the words which really help us to understand what biblical miracles are about. Example, Moses looking back to the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, and he reminds his people that with your own eyes you saw these great trials, those miraculous signs, the signs, and those great wonders. And of course what Moses is referring to here is the plagues of Egypt that finally got Pharaoh deciding he wants to get rid of these slaves out of Egypt and get rid of them, and caused him to let them go out in the desert, and then he tried to catch up with them in his army, and they're in deep prayer as they face this challenge of getting out, and so they get across the Sea of Reeds. By the way, Sea of Reeds is probably the correct translation, not the Red Sea. That's a long story. But this is really interesting, because when we look at the text of Exodus chapter 14, which describes the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, as the Israelites were praying for a way of escape, we read that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground. So the text here, note, describes how the miracle happened. This is nothing to do with the breaking of the laws of nature, but rather a miracle of timing, a sign of God's grace in particular historical context. Now, if you want to have more details about that, then I recommend a professor from this university, Colin Humphreys' book. Colin is was recently, until recently, the professor of material science, and is specialized rather in looking at these miracles of the Old Testament. This is the book, The Miracles of Exodus, where you'll find a lot of fascinating detail about some of these miracles. When we come to the New Testament, the word sign to refer to the miracles of Jesus, in this case now, are just all over the place, especially in the Gospel of John. I think you've got some copies of John's Gospel on the table in front of you, and feel free to take those and to look at that for yourself. When one of the followers of Jesus called Peter, he was preaching to the great crowds of people on the first day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit was given to those very early followers of Christ. And he said this, he proclaimed that on the day of Pentecost, Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, semeion, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. And if you read John's Gospel, it always refers to miracles there as semeion, as signs. That's the language that John uses. And in fact, the first miracle that Jesus ever performed at Cana of Galilee was very much about one of these key signs, and it was the miracle of changing water into wine at a wedding at Cana of Galilee. So, clearly, this symbolizes the inauguration of this new era in which Christ is to save people by his death on the cross. And Holy Communion, to the present day, is a service of remembrance in churches like this one, in which Christians participate in drinking wine, a little bit of wine, which symbolizes Christ's death on the cross for our sin. Well, of course, at the same time, it demonstrates Christ's power and exertion over and his complete control over the whole of creation. Here we have Jesus, the Son of God, whom John tells us in his Gospel, through whom all things were made that have been made. So this is Jesus also in the creation, the Creator, exerting control over the created order. And so notice this miracle then is set within a matrix, within understanding that Christ is truly who he claimed to be, the Son of God. Well, if that's true of the first miracle that Jesus did, then how much more is it true of the very last miracle in which he was involved, his own resurrection from the dead? I hope you come back, by the way, on November the 10th, I think is the date, if you can correct me, when there will be a talk here by Andrew Fellows on the evidence for the resurrection. There's a huge amount of evidence for the resurrection. I certainly find it very convincing. That's why I'm a Christian. But again, I want to draw your attention to the semiotics, if you like, the meaning of the resurrection, what's going on here. Because if this is really true, then it demonstrates Christ's power over sin and death. It demonstrates the power of sin was unable to hold Christ in the tomb. It means that Christ is alive today. We can come to know Christ personally for ourselves. And it means that there really is life after death. If you want to ask Christians, what is the evidence for life after death? They will point to the resurrection. They're not going to point to after-body experiences or something like that. They're going to point to the resurrection of Christ. And it means, as I say, that Christ is alive today and we can know him personally for ourselves. As I have known him, by the way, since becoming a Christian a few years ago. Actually, I did it up the other day. It's 59 years and a little bit, to be precise. Okay, there you go. You can work out my age. So, how are biblical miracles then different from David Hume's understanding, from Richard Dawkins' understanding, and so forth? 3 key differences I want to point out to you. First of all, as I've been saying, they're set within this matrix of belief in God as creator and sustainer of everything that exists. And that, if you have that worldview, is clearly going to change your attitude towards the plausibility of the evidence and how you think about miracles and so forth. Be it miracles of timing, many of those in the Bible, or miracles where the actual physical properties of the universe, of the matter of the world, appear to have been changed. So, for those of us who believe in a creator God who upholds and sustains all that exists, then we might not be totally surprised if God chooses to do things differently on rare occasions. And secondly, it's the meaning of the miracles then that are really key. Miracles as signs of God's grace in particular historical circumstances. These are no random anomalous events that don't have any clear explanation, which is kind of a Dawkins type of way, I think he talks about miracles. But these are miracles that have particular meanings and a particular matrix. They make sense, they're coherent, they're part of the narrative. That's really important. And then thirdly, I would say the biblical miracles lie beyond science. They belong perhaps more to history because they're unique historical events. Science is great at investigating things which are reproducible or where you can infer past history from present scientific data and so forth. But when it comes to historical events, you're very dependent really on eyewitnesses, and this is the world really of historical investigation. And that's why the early followers of Christ made so much of the evidence for the resurrection, citing the 500 who had seen Christ at one time, the many other appearances of Christ after his death and resurrection. And so what science and history have in common is that they're really interested in evidence, but different kinds of evidence. Finally, I just want to say I find it really fascinating that falsifiability, that principle that crops up in science all the time, you do actually find that in historical research when it's close to the purported event, and you find it in the writings of Paul in the New Testament when he was talking about the resurrection in his letter to the church in Corinth in about AD 54, AD 55. That's about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. And so he's writing to them about what happens when you die. And basically he's saying, if the resurrection of Christ hadn't happened, then Christian faith is really futile. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So let's eat and drink and be merry, and tomorrow we die. Okay, that's his philosophy. Which is great. I mean, I love that, because it would have been so easy for the friends and family of Jesus to discover the body of Jesus embalmed had it been in some tomb still in Jerusalem. So he was really setting himself up for refutation, potential refutation, which of course never happens. And I can really identify with empirical reasoning processes of that early church, although of course we're much more distant from the actual evidence now, 2,000 years later. So, evidence, potential falsifiability really matter, and miracles can be really good, and they can be really true. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. We're going to have a couple of minutes now, round tables, to discuss what we've heard. So anything you agree with, anything you disagree with. I've had some questions texted in already, so keep texting those in, and we'll have a time for Q&A in just a couple of moments. Wonderful. Sorry to break in there. Do carry on chatting about those afterwards. We're going to make a start on questions. So first question even. Why do we not see the same scale of miracles that happened in the Bible today?
Well, that's a great question. I guess everyone heard that. So why don't we see the same scale of miracles in the Bible today as we see in the Bible? Well, I think we have to recognize, first of all, that the coming of Jesus itself was a unique event. I mean, Christians believe that Christ was God incarnate. This is God coming into the world in the person of Christ to declare his new kingdom and to bring a message of salvation, which he himself carried out through his death and resurrection. So this is a really unique event. And so it's associated with these whole array of very special miracles which point to the future coming of his coming again. So Christians also believe that Christ is coming again and there will be a new heavens and new earth, a place where Christ's rule will be fulfilled and will be complete. And so, as it were, C.S. Lewis actually had this wonderful idea, I think, of a sort of door opening to the future where a nice warm wind blows through the door into our present cold sort of environment, as it were. And so the miracles are like a smell, they're like a picture, a model of what the future kingdom is going to be like. So yes, they were very special, point one, but special, point two, there's no reason, according to the biblical text, why miracles cannot happen today. The problem is, of course, people are rather quick to claim miracles, which, when you look at them and look at the evidence, doesn't look very convincing. But we also remember that the word miracle can refer to any special sign of God's grace in people's lives and so forth. So we have to remember that as well.
Great, thank you. We do have a mic going round, so if you'd like to come back on that or ask another question off the floor, just stick up a hand. Anyone want to come back on that or ask a different question? Okay, let's go for a different question. So if one believes that miracles and potentially even the resurrection didn't take place, but were created in order to strengthen the parables of Jesus, are they any less of a Christian?
Right, so what I would say here is that actually the resurrection is quite central to Christian belief, the bodily resurrection of Christ. Of course, he had a different kind of body in his resurrection, but it was a pattern of the kind of resurrection that everybody will have. So Jesus, finally. So it's very central, and its meaning is central, and it covers all those various things that we mentioned a few moments ago. So if Christ wasn't raised from the dead bodily, if it's just a parable, like, here's a good example for somebody, well, this is a wonderful thing to do, then that's sort of missing the point, really, of why Christ was raised. He was raised to demonstrate God's power over death, God's power over sin, and so forth, and all those things that we have up there on the screen. So I think as soon as you accept, well, Jesus was just a nice guy, and, he has some lovely teachings, and then this is a kind of parable for us, it didn't really happen, his bones are still mouldering away somewhere in a tomb in Jerusalem. Well, that misses the point. That misses the point that Christ really was the Son of God and is the Son of God and is alive today and so on. So I would say there is a very sharp distinction between the two kind of possibilities there. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone like to come back on that? Ask a question off that? Okay, so this links a little bit to the first question. This is a different question texted in. Do we have any empirical evidence for miracles from the last kind of 5-10 years?
Empirical evidence for miracles in the last 5 to 10 years. Actually, there's a guy called Peter May, who is a Christian, who's a medic, and he spent a lot of time going around investigating a lot of the claimed miracles or healings that you find, and actually he's written a whole book on this thing, but his view is that there isn't much there that's really very convincing. Okay, he's a bit of a skeptic, and the reason he's a skeptic as a Christian, and Christians should be skeptical of things as well as believing things, and so the reason he's a bit of a skeptic, I think, is because the evidence doesn't really stack up that this was something really amazing. Now, having said that, I cases which are kind of quiet, personal cases where there are remarkable changes in people, remarkable healings which are difficult to explain. I don't personally believe it's terribly important how, do we label that a miracle? I mean, you could probably, as a medic, maybe you could find out some rapid processes going on there, which sometimes happens in cancer remissions and things like that. I don't think that's really the key point in terms of the biblical understanding of miracles, because if you think about a miracle as a sign of God's grace in particular circumstances, let's say you've got somebody who's really dying, and as far as you know, they're going to die, and they've got the church praying for them and Christians praying for them or something like that, and then suddenly they become remarkably well again, and sometimes that does happen. Does it matter if we know the process is going on there or not? I don't think it does. Personally, I'm speaking as a biochemist here, by the way. So it just seems to me that it's that context in which they find themselves, whatever the mechanism, God has brought them back to life again and brought them and given them new life. So I knew plenty of cases like that. But whether to label them as miracles, I'm not too fussed about that myself. I have to say that, actually. It's not that important for me.
Thank you. So another one. If your account of the possibility of miracles relies on belief in the existence of God, do you have to give up the idea that miracles can themselves provide evidence which can justify Christian belief?
That's a really great question. Of course, for the 17th century, as I mentioned, people were really big there on miracles as being evidence for the truth of the Christian faith. I think probably the two things to say here, really. Obviously, 2,000 years later, after the resurrection of Christ, we're not in the same position as the original disciples who, been with Jesus for 3 years, saw him die on the cross, saw him definitely die, saw the blood flow from his side, and then he came alive, and then saw him alive again. We're not in that position, are we? So they had evidence right staring them in the face. So, actually, there was one disciple called Thomas who was really a kind of doubter and sort of professional doubter, and he didn't really believe what other people had told him about, the other disciples told him about seeing Jesus until he had seen Christ for himself. So that's something, isn't it? But 2,000 years later, is it evidence? Can we see the evidence of the resurrection? Yes, I think we can, but there's very good evidence and so on. But you can't pretend it's the same as it was in the first century for the people who first encountered Christ. So I think we need a balance here. Okay, we need a balance. And I think most people who become Christians that I know and who didn't believe in the resurrection and came to believe in it, see more of the whole, it's like a sort of package really, you suddenly realize, wow, Christ really was the Son of God. This all fits. Okay, his miracles fit. The resurrection fits. It makes sense. So it's a whole narrative that fits together, I think, that people often will come to accept after considering the evidence for themselves.
Thank you. Anyone got anything to say from that? We can send the mic round again if anyone would like to stick up a hand. No? Okay, so another question. If miracles are good and true, then can science be too? Do you think that some miracles are violations on laws of nature? And if so, can belief in them be reconciled with a scientific worldview?
Right, I think we have to just talk a little bit more here about the laws of nature. So I went over that, of course, very, very quickly through lack of time. So we don't really have exactly the same idea of the laws of nature that people did in the 17th century. So they are descriptive and not prescriptive, if that makes sense. In other words, they're not like traffic lights that things have to obey. There's nothing, the matter has to obey the laws of nature, like a sort of traffic light in that sense. And so what are they? And of course, there's a very big literature here in the philosophy of science literature. But I think most scientists will think of them as descriptive, as very fine descriptions, often mathematically, of the properties of matter that just every time we know about it, they work. And if you apply them to doing experiments, they work beautifully and so forth. So they're laws in that sense. As I say, they are descriptive, not prescriptive. And laws change. Actually, in biology, we don't really have laws. I mean, we do call Mendelian laws, that sort of thing, but then biologists end up making all these exceptions. So it's really the physics people, mathematical physics, that really come up with these great laws and so forth. So even within the different disciplines, the understanding of law changes a bit. Okay. So you might ask the question, well, if God is the source of the coherence of the universe that allows these laws to exist, because, after all, they're just descriptions in the Christian worldview of what God is doing, then how come there can be these occasional exceptions? Well, these exceptions are very rare, and you wouldn't notice them in the course of science. There's no worry about doing a PhD and thinking this miracle might pop up in your next experiment. I don't think it's going to happen. Okay, so in other words, these are very, very unusual events. And so in terms of the miracles that actually involve the change in properties of matter, like changing water into wine, we know that doesn't happen. Okay, we know that doesn't happen. So that's what classifies it as a very special miracle with a very, very special meaning. So if the laws, in other words, originate in the will of God and his creative power, then clearly God can do things differently on rare occasions according to his plan and purpose. That wouldn't be totally unexpected. But you don't have to worry about the normal working of science. After all, modern science really got going in the 17th century, and these were all got going by people who all believed in miracles. So they didn't see that as a problem for establishing the science that we practice today.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to make that the last question, but you had some resources you wanted to mention maybe
Yeah,
just
so
briefly?
just on the screen, which I will put back up again, which I lost. So I just have a few resources there, and I want to mention one particular resource very briefly, which is a Faraday paper. So in the Faraday Institute, which is part of my college, which is St. Edmund's College, we have a website, there it is, and up there we got a whole lot of resources, and if you go to resources and then Faraday papers, you'll see a whole list of papers there on science and faith. Only 4,000 words long, not too long. Many different languages, in Chinese and Serbian, and all kinds of languages there, so if you prefer another language. But paper number 20 is not quite yet published. I actually have just written this paper on miracles, as it happens, miracles and science, not quite there yet. It'll be up there by next week, okay, so I just flagged that up. And there's some really useful video resources, talks online, helpful articles. I'll leave that up. You can copy those down. And by the way, if anyone wants these slides, let me know. I'm very happy to give anybody here these slides for your own personal use. Thank you. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dennis. Can we give Dennis a round of applause? And that is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But if you're not in a rush to get off, there are snacks coming out onto tables, and so do keep chatting about what we've heard. And Dennis will be around here afterwards as well, and he'd love to chat more. So if your question didn't get answered, come and speak to him. On your tables, you'll see some feedback cards. We'd love to know how you found the event, what you enjoyed, what can be improved. And if you'd like to think more about this and other questions, just tick the I'm interested box, and someone from the Christian Union will get in touch. Next week, we're back. We'll be looking at freedom. Have we got there? And before that, lots of colleges are going to be running discussion groups called Share. So on your tables, you'll see these flyers for Share. This is a chance to discuss what we think freedom means, and then to see what Jesus has to say as well. And they'll be running for the next 3 weeks looking at different topics. Look on the website, because there'll be specific details for your college on there. Dennis mentioned some of those resources there, and there's also some books at the back which are free for you to take away to think about this more. I think that's all from me. Thanks so much again for coming.